Geraldine Jamieson on Manx Radio.
Hello and a very warm welcome to this week's programme. Now, if I begin by saying that my celebrated guest today can recall the exact minute that he became interested in astronomy, it happened actually when he was just 6 years of age, and that he has been presenting the very popular BBC television programme Sky at Night for 35 and a half years, since April 1957. Well, you'll know at once that it must be Britain's most revered astronomer, Patrick Moore. Now, why, Patrick, was your gaze lifted heavenly to the firmaments, and why exactly do you remember that moment so vividly when you were just 6 years of age?
I then lived at East Grinstead. I was sitting in the armchair. It was a rainy day, and I was rather bored. And I looked in the bookcase next to the armchair. Now, my mother was always a bit interested in astronomy. I don't mean wildly so, but just enough to have one or two small books on it. And my eye fell on a small blue book called The Story of the Solar System by G.F. Chambers, published in 1898, price sixpence. And I mean 6 proper pence, not our modern 6 Mickey Mouse pence. And I picked this up and I started reading it. It wasn't actually a boy's book, but my reading was all right, and I read that book through in one gulp and decided it was interesting. I then looked round. I found the companion, The Story of the Stars. I read that, even more interesting, and I simply went on from there.
And there was a particular visit. You went somewhere which was all to do with the planet Saturn, but in fact you were really a lot more interested in the moon, I gather, as a young boy.
An old friend of our family was a Major A.E. Levine, who lived in Sirius, where I now live, but I didn't then. And he had a telescope, and I went down there, and he showed me Saturn through his telescope. And that was my first view of the heavens. And of course it was quite staggering. I think Saturn is probably the best thing to see first go.
And after that, then, you went for the moon a little bit.
I, first of all, did the right thing. The thing not to do, by the way, when you get interested, is to go and try and buy a very small telescope. It wasn't so even then, even less so now. So I managed to borrow a pair of binoculars. I then took an elementary star map. I went out at night and I started teaching myself the constellations, which doesn't take very long. And I made a pious resolve to learn one new constellation every clear night. And before long I knew my way around the sky. I then looked round with binoculars, and I may say here, anyone who tries this, whatever you do, don't look at the sun. Luckily, I was warned about that at a very early stage. And finally, I did save up, and I managed to get a small telescope, a 3-inch refractor, and it cost £7, 10 shillings. That was quite a lot in those days, of course. And I got this when I was about 10, I suppose. Looked round, looked at the moon, thought that was extremely interesting, and decided I'd make the moon my own particular study, which I've done ever since.
But how did you know you were going on the right lines? If you said that your mother was only fractionally interested, who was really guiding these early steps? So important.
I was lucky. Major Levine was an old friend of our family. He gave me guiding steps. And actually, when I was 11 years old, I proposed for membership of the British Astronomical Association. So I became a member at the age of 11. And I say 50 years later, I was president.
My goodness. But weren't you the youngest member at 11?
Yes.
They'd never had such a keen youngster before.
I think I must have been the youngest member, yes. I remember going up to be welcomed into the association by the then president, who was the Astronomer Royal, Sir Harold Spencer-Jones, whom I got to know very well afterwards, of course, but I was only 11 years old then. I sent in my first paper to the BAA when I was 13. It was entitled Small Craterlets in the Mare Crisium, which I'd done with my own little telescope, which was a bit of research stuff. And I had a letter back from the then president saying, "This paper has been accepted for publication. Will you present it at the next meeting?" And I wrote back, "Dear Sir Harold, I'd be honoured to present the paper. You realise I'm only 13. I've still got his letter. I said, "Thank you for your letter. I note you're only 13. I don't see what that's got to do with it." So I gave the paper.
You had actually a troublesome childhood, really. Not many people will probably know this,
I was an awful
Patrick.
nuisance. Well, from the age of 6 to 16, I really was in and out of bed the entire time with a slightly crocked heart, which was an awful nuisance. Meant that my schooling was badly interrupted. I mean, I took common sense reason, passed it, never went there. Managed one term at prep school, had to do it with tutors. Finally got my school exams as an external candidate, and by that time I was 16. And then, of course, the war broke out. And I knew perfectly well there was no chance of my passing the medical for the forces, so all I could do was to tack 2 years onto my age, fake the medical, get in and fly, which I did.
You're very proud, actually, to wear most of the time the RAF navigator's tie.
I still wear it, I think, almost all the time. I've only got 3 kinds of tie. I've got this one, my Halley's Comet tie, which is the motif of the Halley's Comet Society, which has no aims, no objects, and no ambitions. It is the only completely useless society in the entire world, apart, of course, from the common market.
Now, tell me, how did your serious progression with astronomy then really begin?
Well, of course, when the war broke out, I had my sights set on university. I had everything lined up for Cambridge, I thought. Well, the war came along, because that didn't come off. And at the end of the war, if I had gone to Cambridge as planned, it would have meant taking a government grant. And that is not in my line. Either I do a thing myself or I don't do it. So I thought, right, I will do a bit of writing. And I'd started writing even then. And when I can, I'll pay my way through university. I wrote a book called Guide to the Moon, which caught on. I wrote one called Guide to the Planets, which caught on. And I never had time to do it. Therefore, I never did actually make university, and my doctorates are purely honorary. And I may say my second book, Guide to the Planets, must have been written in 1946 or 7, I suppose. And my next job this year is to rewrite it for the umpteenth time. The synopsis is the same, the content is very different.
You were going to study, I think, geology at Cambridge.
I intended to take geology, yes. I didn't mean to take my degree in astronomy itself, but I knew from the word go that whatever I did, I would end up by being a writer. I remember being asked when I was about 5 what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said, I want to write, and I knew that from the word go. And I may say, when I was 6 years old, my mother found in our loft my grandfather's old 1892 Remington typewriter, and I was given this to play with. And instead of playing with it, I taught myself to type. And that machine is still in perfect order, and in my will, it's left to the Science Museum when its twin is. And then when I was 8 years old, someone produced a 1908 Woodstock typewriter, upon which everything is done to this day.
Amazing. Your father was totally different from yourself.
Oh, totally, yes.
You say.
He was typical army officer, yes. He was an army officer. Went through the First World War, collecting things like MCs, and also a lungful of gas, unfortunately. He never really fit afterwards. Yeah. I don't really take after him at all.
Except in the cricketing passion.
No, he wasn't a cricketer. He was a champion hockey. He was a very good hockey player, played hockey for Middlesex for many years, and a very good amateur boxer. Not really a cricketer. I've got no athletic ability at all. I don't pretend to have. So any game I play, I've got to play wrong. And I've played a lot of cricket in my time. Still do.
Spin bowler, I think. If
Spin bowler, I think, but number 11 bat. I belong to that class of club cricketer who's taken many more wickets than they made runs, which wouldn't be very difficult.
I really should be calling you, of course, Patrick Caldwell Moore.
It is my name, yes.
Yeah. Your father used it. Your father used it.
Yes, he did, but it's a bit of a mouthful. I signed myself Patrick Moore. The very first time I went to Russia, that was a bit of a problem, because I signed my name, Patrick Moore, looked on my passport. What is this? This is not your name, and I had to explain that one away. It's my name, all right, but it's a bit of a mouthful to write. So,
how was The Sky at Night actually born?
It was the brainchild of Paul Johnstone. Now, he wasn't an astronomer. He was, in fact, an archaeologist and a good one. He wasn't an astronomer. He was a BBC producer, and he had the idea of doing a regular way that hadn't been done before. I think he'd heard me doing a broadcast or something, I don't know. Certainly read one of my books called Suns, Myths and Men, and he rang me up and said, would you like to come and have a go at a programme to be called The Sky at Night? Actually, it was Star Map to start with. We altered it before it went on the air. And I said, what a good idea. So I went to see him. We arranged to do a first programme of the Sky at Night series. And the BBC said, right, we'll put it on the air once every 4 weeks for 3 months to see how it goes. That was 35.5 years ago. We're still going.
How do you keep the freshness?
It's not a question of what to put in. It's a question of what to leave out. There's always so much you want to do and just no time to do it. The number of topics we can carry is absolutely staggering. There's no problem there at all.
Goodness me, I would have thought. Except, of course, that obviously the people maybe watching now, you've got a whole different generation or a couple of generations.
And there are new things every time. I mean, for example, just to give you one example, the month before last, my old friend David Allen was over. He's actually English, but lives in Australia and works at the Siding Spring Observatory. He's a planetary specialist, and he'd been looking at the planet Venus, which is now, of course, brilliantly visible low down in the evening sky in the west after sunset, looking like a lovely evening star. Rather a hostile kind of place, and we can't actually see the surface normally because it's hidden by a thick, cloudy atmosphere. Now, David Allen has been doing research using infrared techniques and actually recorded surface detail for the first time. And, of course, he was over briefly in England, and we did a programme with him straight away.
Have we discovered all the planets now?
I think probably not. After all, the first 5, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, they are naked eye things. We've known those ever since prehistoric times. Uranus, you can just see with the naked eye, discovered in 1781. Neptune you can't, discovered in 1846. Pluto you can't, discovered by my old friend Clyde Tombaugh in 1930. There's probably another planet out there. We call it Planet X, and we think we can prove it's there because of slight irregularities in the movements of the planets we can see. But there are very slight irregularities, and we're not sure where Planet X is. It can't even prove definitely exists, but I think it does. There are odd things out there, but little things. I mean, only a few months ago, a strange thing, less than 200 miles across, was discovered going around the Sun, way beyond Neptune and Pluto. They're not a proper planet. It's probably what they call a planetesimal, one of the building blocks out of which the planets grew up.
Is there life elsewhere? Something I've been dying to ask you.
In our own solar system, the answer, I think, is probably no. Certainly the only planet in the solar system suited for intelligent life is the Earth. Now, whether intelligent life has appeared here is quite another matter, but it could do. The other planets, well, they're fairly hopeless from our point of view. Mercury got no atmosphere. Venus has poisonous atmosphere, poisonous clouds. Mars, the atmosphere there is very thin, the temperature very low. The giant planets haven't even got solid surfaces. So in our own solar system, I'm quite sure we're alone. But of course, remember this. Our Sun is an ordinary star, one of 100,000 million stars in our galaxy or star system alone. And we know of thousands of millions of galaxies. So the total number of stars we know to exist is absolutely staggering. And I refuse to believe that our own perfectly ordinary, unimportant, run-of-the-mill Sun is the only star in all that lot to have an inhabited planet going around it. I don't believe that for a moment. And I'm quite sure that there are many other Earths going around many other suns, and that life is widespread. But saying that is one thing, and proving it is quite another, and I have no proof at all.
What about Galileo? I mean, he virtually was ostracised, wasn't he, by the Roman Catholic Church for saying those years ago the Earth revolving around the Sun.
The Church has just realised that Galileo was right. It's taken them about 300 years, but they have last done it, I'm glad to say.
And they're developing a new telescope, I think. I mean, Pope John Paul II, the current Pope, is rather good about this. I mean,
there's been a major observatory in the Vatican now for a great many years, ever since the turn of the century. I mean, a very good astronomical observatory right in the Vatican. They've done splendid work. So I think the Church has just realised it's not a bad idea to admit that Galileo was right.
Talking about observatories and planetariums, I mean, one of your earliest appointments must have been director of Armagh Planetarium.
My only appointment. In point of fact, the only post I've ever held in my life, or ever want to hold. In point of fact, my director of Armagh Observatory, Eric Lindsay, was a very old friend of mine, and he had the idea of putting up a planetarium in Armagh itself. And he said, will you come and start the thing off? I said, right, I'll come over, I'll do what you want me to do, I'll start it off, and I'll be director for the first 3 years. So I did precisely that. I went over there, we set it up, and I was the first founding director, and I stayed there for 3 years until it was really on its feet.
It was very innovative, wasn't it, at the time?
There have been many other planetariums, and the first ones go back to the 1920s. There have been plenty of planetaria over the world, but none previously in Ireland. And there's only one in England, that's the London Planetarium, set up in 1960, and they were very keen for me to go and be the first director of that, but I said, no, thanks very much.
Why? Is it because you perhaps don't like the discipline, you know, of the business angle of it all?
I'm no businessman, and although I was director, it wasn't really my scene at all, but going to London would have meant living in London, and that is not for me. I like dark skies, I like the country. I live right on the end of Selsey Bill, with sea on 3 sides of me, and there I stay. I wake up in the morning to the sound of the sea and seagulls, and that's all right by me.
Now, what about this business where we're being taught nowadays to invest in less lighting, you know, because of light pollution, and councils are looking at this, etc.?
They are indeed. The point is this. People say that astronomers want to put the lights out. Absolute nonsense. We don't. What we are saying is make economical use of lighting and make sure that it shines down, not up. And there are 2 reasons for that. First of all, it means that there's no light pollution. That suits us. But also it means that the illumination on the ground is even and safe. For example, consider these horrible globe lights you see around. Well, you put them on at night, and there's a pool of darkness underneath them. Anyone can lurk in there and spring out. These are absolutely dangerous. So we're trying to persuade people now to install sensible lighting. And we are not suggesting replacing all the present lights. What we are saying is, when they wear out, and they do, then replace them with lights that shine down, not up. And I did a programme a little while ago on television about this with Derek McNally, and then the Minister of the Environment, David McLean, rang me up himself and said, would I go and see him? And I went to see him about this, and he's a most unusual politician. A very nice chap, quite charming, thoroughly sensible, takes advice, investigates, and acts upon it. I mean, he's much, much too sensible to be a politician. He can't possibly last. Anyhow, there he is at the moment. And he accepted our recommendation. They're sending him around to every council. So we are hoping indeed that something will be done. And quite apart from the benefit to astronomers and the benefit for safety on ground lighting, it will save something like £18 million a year on wasted light. So we're hoping for results there.
Yeah. NASA, you've always been very interested in NASA.
I've been associated with it for a long time. Because, I was one of the official mappers of the moon before the Apollo astronauts went there. So I've been mixed up with NASA for a long time.
Well, I remember actually a guest on this programme. I must say I've interviewed 3 American astronauts, and one became quite a good friend who stayed with us here a few times on the island, and that was Colonel Jim Irwin, sadly passed away 18 months ago.
See my watch strap there?
Yes.
In 1988, they had Expo 88 in Brisbane. Jim Irwin and I were the 2 speakers. And they gave us these astronauts' watches, which I've got on now. And they gave one to Jim also. His strap was too big for his wrist. I've got a much thicker wrist. Mine was too small. So that watch strap actually contains about 4 links from Jim Irwin's chain.
Ah, that's wonderful.
And very sadly,
Memento.
Jim, of course, had died. He's the first astronaut to go. But I know all the Apollo astronauts.
But he was such a wonderful orator. No wonder the 2 of you were guest speakers in Brisbane.
Chap, yes.
Marvellous.
Very, very sad about Jim. Rotten luck.
Well,
The interesting thing here is that the first man on the moon is Neil Armstrong, whom I know very well. The first man in space was Yuri Gagarin, 1961. And the first airman was Orville Wright. And I actually met all 3 of those. I mean, I met Gagarin, and I also met Orville Wright, who didn't actually die till 1948. And what I find interesting is that the first airman, the first spaceman, and the first man on the moon could actually have met. They didn't, but they could have done because their lives overlapped.
Gracious.
Shows how far we've gone in less than a century.
Would you have liked to have been an astronaut yourself, Patrick?
It would need a very massive rocket to launch me. Yes, I'd love to have gone, but I knew from the word go that I had no chance, because firstly, I'm too old. And secondly, as I say, when the war broke out, I couldn't honestly pass the medical. And although it's perfectly right to fake your medical in time of war, it's not so in time of peace, even if I could have done, which would have been totally out of the question. So I knew from the start that I had no hope at all of getting into space. But I'm glad to have played a very minor role in moon mapping and trying to spread the word.
Well, talking of war and indeed pollution and the problem of our current environment, etc., I do remember actually Jim Irwin standing one lovely moonlit night in our little Manxstone cottage garden. And he said, you know, when I looked down from the moon, he said it was so marvellous to see the beautiful lakes, the blue seas, the green earth, because the moon itself, the surface of the moon, was so barren, it was very uninteresting, just rocks and dust. And he said, it makes me feel so sad that man is destroying it all down here. That always remains in my mind, I must say, about Jim Irwin.
I totally agree. I was talking not so long ago to the last man on the moon, Gene Cernan, and he was saying that probably his greatest thrill was on standing on the lunar surface and then looking up and seeing the Earth 250,000 miles away. Because you're quite right. No one's ever bettered Buzz Aldrin's description of the moon as magnificent desolation, which is exactly what it is. And I only hope we don't turn the Earth into the same kind of thing.
So all these Apollo missions, then, to the moon, what did we learn from it all?
We learned a great deal about the moon itself, more about the back history of the solar system, more about the back history of the Earth, more about astronomy, more about physics, more about science. But I still come across the occasional idiot who says, look, why spend money on space when there's so much to be done down here? And as soon as I get that, I realise I'm dealing with someone who hasn't bothered to do their homework. Because quite apart from the overall international aspect, there is so much in the way of spin-off. And I went the other day down to a big hospital in Bristol, and there I saw the results of a new miniaturized photographic procedure that was developed for the use by astronauts. They were using it to scan an unborn baby and look for defects.
Goodness.
There are plenty of spin-off there.
Yeah. Is your whole time taken up now travelling around the world, lecturing and visiting?
I do very little lecturing, believe me, hardly any. The only second lecture I've given in the last few months.
But I thought you'd have been so much in demand.
Probably haven't got time to do everything. I wish you had. I gave the Isaac Newton lecture at Newton's old school last week, and that was the previous one that I gave. And I haven't got any more lined up at the moment. Although late next week I'm playing at a charity concert for handicapped children. It's rather different. I turned into a xylophone player for the evening.
Yes, so that's another interest of yours,
yes.
Isn't it? Music, xylophone. Yeah. And I think, was it on your This Is Your Life programme? I can't remember the name of that woman, that marvellous woman who's
Evelyn
totally
Glennie.
Stone deaf.
Evelyn Glennie. They caught me on This Is Your Life way about 1972. Well, I helped to catch Evelyn Glennie. She's 24. She's Scottish. She is the best percussionist in the world, best xylophone player, best marimba player, best drummer, I think, and she can't hear a thing. She began going deaf when she was 6. After 13, she became stone deaf, and she's absolutely marvellous. And, of course, she lip reads so marvellously that you can't tell. She also lip reads French, and I believe a bit of Japanese as well. She's quite an incredible person.
But, I mean, what I find it very hard to take on board, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners, and probably your good self when you first met her, Patrick, is that she obviously can't hear the music she's making.
She can't hear a thing. No, because she can't hear anything at all. You tell me how she does it. All I can say is, you tell me. But I wish to goodness I could play in the way that she does, because nobody can.
No. It's a God-given gift, that, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Now, would you like to have taken up music as a career?
No.
Had you not been struck down by the moon and so on
No,
and
not
the
a bit.
stars?
I've never had a music lesson in my life. I'm a complete fake. But I don't know what to do. I'm a tunesmith. The last thing I wrote, the band of the Royal Parachute Brigade, they had a big march in London last year, and they said they'd like a new old-fashioned march. So I wrote the march out of the sky for them. They're now happily using. Heard it on the radio the other day. But I've never had a music lesson. Yeah. I can read and write and orchestrate. I taught myself, but that's as far as it goes. And I'm purely a tunesmith. I'm not a serious musician at all.
Do you like a bit of a party? I mean, how did you enjoy your own This Is Your Life and afterwards?
It was great fun. Of course, I was completely taken in. I didn't suspect a thing. They rang me and said, it was 1973, it must have been. They were doing a children's annual and wanted a picture on the cover of me sitting in one of the old moon cars where I go with this photograph. So perfectly right to do so. And I went up and I was going to put my old disreputable sports coat, and my mother said, "That's funny, darling, I can't find it. Must have gone to the laundry." But the suit on, weren't you? So I did so. Of course, I went to the studio. It was Eminem. This Is Your Life. Tremendous fun.
And had they got people from, all over Britain and so forth?
Oh, yes, indeed, yes, rather.
Unfortunately, I must say there's one that I missed. You can't pick them all of them, but it's an amazing programme.
Before your time. Ages ago. Long before you came along.
Unfortunately, I can't claim that.
Long time ago. Must have been 1972 or 3, I suppose.
I thought it was quite interesting, Patrick, when you talked earlier there about archaeology and astronomy being so akin. Because, if we go back to the ancient Egyptians, for instance, they built that marvellous, amongst the pyramids,
The pyramids,
Giza.
yes, indeed.
Right. And they used the pole star, didn't they?
The then pole star,
The
not our
then
present
pole
one.
star.
The Thuban or Alpha Draconis was the pole star in those days.
And they actually allowed for the shift in the Earth axis as well.
No, they didn't actually. They lined it up with what was then the pole of the sky. We know where it was. The pole then was near Alpha Draconis. Now it's near Polaris. But we can date it in that way.
And is this the sort of stuff that interests you as well?
I'm very interested in all aspects of astronomical history. So, yes, I am very interested in this. I've only seen the pyramids once. They are, of course, in the garden of a hotel, as you know. But they're interesting to see. There's an awful lot of pyramid.
What about the Dogon tribe of Africa? They know about the pup of Sirius.
That, I'm afraid, is total and absolute rubbish.
Is it?
In Dogon mythology, everything is double, so quite clearly Sirius is double too. No, that's complete and utter nonsense. But the trouble is, when you come into astronomy, you always come across what I call the crazy gang. The astrologers, the flying saucer people, and all on the flat earthers, the hollow globers, and they cause a certain amount of chaos. They are usually quite harmless, apart from the astrologers. And of course, astrology, which is the superstition of the stars, it does prove one important scientific fact, and it's quite simply this: there's one born every minute.
So have you ever been, for instance, on a panel with an astrologer?
I did many years ago, but really I say now, if I'm asked to do so, I'm sorry, it's the closed season for crackpots. I've got better things to do.
Do you think that man will ever conquer the universe?
No.
In 1,000 years, perhaps.
No, I
Surely
don't.
technology might make it all possible.
Not in the universe. What I'm sure we will do, and we can do if we act sensibly, we can colonize the moon. You can never turn the moon into a kind of second Earth. You can never give it an atmosphere that it would retain, for example, so it's going to be very limited. And I'm sure we will set up colonies upon Mars, too. And further than that, frankly, I'm not prepared to go, because the other planets in our solar system are totally hostile. I don't think we can ever establish ourselves there. And when you start talking about colonizing planets of other stars, well, you're dealing in distances of millions of miles, and the idea of sending a spacecraft there is quite out of the question. So if we're ever going to contact other civilizations physically or go there, there's got to be some entirely revolutionary means of doing it. And when you start talking about space warps and time warps and teleportation and thought travel, and you're right into science fiction, Lord Darth Vader, Doctor Who, the Star Trek, pure science fiction. On the other hand, television would have been science fiction not so very long ago, and science fiction does turn into science fact. And although I say that interstellar travel physically is impossible, I am saying that is by our present means. There could be some fundamental breakthrough in the future about which we can't even speculate now. We have nothing to go on. But until it does, we're stuck here. And it may come this year or next year, or 100 years or 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years or never, I don't know. Until it does, we are stuck with the solar system, the Earth, the Moon, and I think Mars.
But how can you say that we will colonize the surface of the moon when, as you say, we need oxygen? They haven't got it.
Colonization may be the wrong term. What I mean is we'll be able to set up major scientific bases there, and I'm prepared to believe that in 100 years from now there may be 1,000 people living on the moon in various airtight bases. But turning it into a kind of second Earth, no. And the same really applies to Mars. Although Mars does have one important advantage over the Moon, there is water there, locked up in the form of ice, and on the Moon there's not. So with the Moon, you've got to take absolutely everything with you. Mars will give you a certain amount of help. But of course, against that, Mars is much further away, and the journey takes far longer. But of course, another thing, both those worlds are smaller than the Earth and pull less strongly. I mean, go to the Moon, have only 1/6 of their Earth weight. Strike me as being a jolly good idea, but be that as it may. Go to Mars, have only 1/3 of your weight. And if we're going to have Martian bases, you have men and women and children. And I wonder, will a boy or girl born and brought up on Mars ever be able to come here? Because just imagine how you'd feel if suddenly, without any increase in your muscle power or your heart power, you suddenly weighed 3 times as much. And it may well be that this time in the next century, there may be 2 entirely different forms of Homo sapiens, people like you and me, and our relations, born and brought up on Mars, who can never actually come to the Earth at all, though because they could go to the Moon. It's points of thought.
Well, when is there going to be a human being on Mars?
At the last meeting of the International Astronomical Union, held last year in South America, which I was at, of course, the general impression was that, all being well, we could certainly get the first men on Mars within 30 years. Now, that may be a bit of optimism, I don't know, but given the right political and financial climate, we could certainly do it within 50 years, and probably earlier than that.
Would you like to be around then?
I'd like to be, but I don't really think I'm going to be. After all, give it 30 years, I'm going to be 100. I think I may not see it, but you may, more likely than I am, and your children may, and your grandchildren certainly will.
Well, now, the Isle of Man Astronomical Society have brought you over here, which I think is very enterprising to have got you here in the first place, and you've become a member of them, and you insisted in being a fully paid-up member.
Certainly. Well, I was delighted to come over here, as I have not been to the Isle for 50 years since the war, but of course the Isle of Man is a very good place for astronomy.
There is a real thirst for knowledge with people nowadays. Do you find that?
I do indeed. Well, I mean, I gave this lecture in the museum last night, absolutely packed out. And therefore I'm quite sure the interest is here. So I very much hope that by coming over, I'll have done something to give the Isle of Man Astronomical Society a fillip up.
I'm quite sure you have. Patrick Moore, it's been a delight to have you on the programme, and I hope we can entice you to come back again soon. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Nice to have been here. Thank you for having me.